Hi there, this is Xavier, your host. I just wanted to remind you that half of the Chicagoland episodes are bonus episodes that you can access by paying $5 monthly on patreon.com/Chicago_land. One issue though, if you're using an iPhone, make sure you go to the Safari app before paying, because if you try to do it directly through the Patreon app, then Apple, the company, takes some of that money and pockets it for themselves. Anyway, enjoy the episode. So, that is the persistent gremlin treated. The problem with my computer was that it was too hot and all I had to do was put an ice pack underneath it. Now, I can plug in literally every peripheral I have at the same time while simultaneously video calling, and it doesn't cause my computer to crash.
So the hot podcasting secrets.
It is so hot. I am in this terrible box right now. But you know what's cool?
What is cool?
The outdated and obsolete technology of cable car street railroads.
Wow, coming at you from the Bay Area, that's extremely relevant to me, actually.
Yes, that's right. So welcome to Lawrence Wang, who's a longtime friend and currently a social worker in Oakland, California.
It's true.
Which is good work. Let me try it again.
Thank you.
Which is incredibly
You're good.
important work that I respect a lot.
You want to make sure your listeners understand how you feel about social work.
That's right. I mean, I needed to. I'm your host, Xavier, pronouns he, him. Welcome to Chicagoland, the geographic history of Chicago and the American Empire. And I think I may have accidentally intercepted your opportunity to have pronouns, but
That's okay. Should I introduce myself? I don't know what.
Oh yeah, tell me about you. How you feeling today?
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm Lawrence Wong. I am, a longtime friend of Xavier's. Excited to be here on the podcast. I admittedly don't know a ton about cable cars, but I did do a tiny bit of research ahead of this because I learned about the topic today.
That's perfect. Yeah, the secret about cable cars, I found out, is that nobody really knows very much, except for maybe like a handful of extreme enthusiasts who I respect. So cable cars. They are a quaint San Francisco tourist attraction. If you're so inclined, I didn't know that was a pun when I wrote it. If you're so inclined, you can ride a beautifully restored cable car as it trundles through Chinatown or over Nob Hill. Get it? Inclines? That was just for me. You can imagine what the city looked like 120 years ago, back when the streets were clogged with manure rather than cars. At least that's the image most people probably associate with the term cable car if they're thinking about it at all. And that's fine. I'm not going to criticize anyone for their lack of awareness of an obsolete 150-year-old transit technology. But I think you ought to know there was a time when cable cars were common sight in cities across the United States, Britain, and Australia, and even New Zealand. Actually, New Zealand was a cable car pioneer, but not part of the episode, sadly.
Could be good bonus episode content.
Oh, gosh.
I am intrigued. For me.
No, totally. Oh, my God. Everything becomes a bonus episode. If it's not directly about Chicago. And when the public thought about cable cars back then, they looked not to San Francisco for guidance, but to Chicago. After all, Chicago in the 1880s and 90s had the world's busiest and most modern cable car network. Only San Francisco had more miles of cable car track, but Chicago's routes reached out further from the downtown core. Not only did Chicago's adoption of the cable car drive the technology's expansion across the English-speaking world, but also the cable car lines shaped the urban form of early Chicago, creating streetcar suburbs that persist as vibrant Chicago neighborhoods. So I don't know if this is true for you. When I learned about Chicago's cable cars, I was a bit surprised.
Never heard of him. Didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah, I think I, read about it once. I was like, oh, whatever, cable cars. They came and went. Who cares? But what I didn't realize is how important they were for a lot of aspects of the city. For example, the downtown tunnels that we're going to talk about later. So yeah, I was kind of surprised they're not just a passing fad in Chicago. They were an important part of the city for, I think, around 25 years. And that they revolutionized not just Chicago, but a bunch of other cities.
Is that the duration of operation or the time they were?
1882, the first line was opened, and 1906, the last bit of cable car track was, well, I don't think it was immediately removed, but it was converted to electric streetcars.
Gotcha. So basically duration of operation. Yeah.
Yeah. So we move into our section. What even is a cable car? Lawrence,
Oh yeah.
you're up.
This is a quiz. Oh man. Oh well, I did do a little bit of research on this too, because I realized despite living in the Bay Area, I didn't have a super great definition of cable car. But my understanding, having done 30 minutes maybe of research, is that
Perfect.
it seems to be defined by basically a running cable that runs all throughout, whatever lines of operation there are. And the cables are in constant movement, basically. What defines a cable car specifically is that they have a gripper that can originally manually, later on they can be electronic, disconnect or from the cable or reconnect, so they can break, like stop the cable. This is as opposed to, I think, a
Oh
funicular, I
yeah,
want to
funiculars
say,
for sure.
right, which are permanently attached to the cable, so they don't have a way of independently stopping. The entire line has to stop.
That's all absolutely true. I'm going to cut to the core, though, with my definition, which is that a cable car is the most steampunk possible way to run a transit line.
Wow, I didn't know we were looking for a vibes definition.
Your definition's correct. My definition's vibes based. Here's a picture of a wheel that just sits underground.
Excellent.
In order to run these giant multi-ton cables that you were describing underneath the city streets, you're going to need massive wheels and pulleys. The cable itself is a thinner version of the mighty cables that were used up to hold monumental bridges during the Victorian era, like the Brooklyn Bridge in New York.
That makes sense.
As a matter of fact, the man who introduced cable cars to San Francisco was the son of a bridge cable manufacturer, which is probably where his expertise came from.
Yeah, early childhood exposure to cables, very dangerous. Gives you wild ideas.
Children should not be exposed to large steel cables. And your definition of, I get to breeze over a little bit of this. Yes, there are other vehicles that are pulled by cables that might be mistaken for cable cars, including funiculars, aerial trams, or even elevators, which are fundamentally kind of similar.
Oh.
So here is a example of a funicular railroad in Dubuque, Iowa.
Whoa.
So the picture at the top is, well, it's a little bit exaggerated. It's a fisheye lens, but it is a very steep incline. And
Gotcha.
these are,
Yeah.
in the U.S., I think the only existing ones are in relatively hilly or mountainous cities where they're used to connect the neighborhoods above and below a bluff. So Dubuque qualifies. It's got a bluff above and then like a flat river valley plain beneath it. Pittsburgh famously has two of them. And the reason the funicular rules is that there are always two cars. There can only be two. And they're connected to a single line over a pulley at the top, so that
Right.
one acts as a counterweight for the other as it ascends.
Yeah.
This is technically not a cable car because a cable car has to be able to detach or reattach to the cable.
I had looked into funiculars a little bit, as you might have been able to guess from my definition. And I think my favorite, like, not very important fact, but like technically correct fact they said was that For passenger comfort, funicular carriages are often, although not always, constructed so that the floor of the passenger deck is horizontal and not necessarily parallel to the silk
There's
track.
also some like weird stuff. Like if you go to the Alps, there's all sorts of weird cables and cog railroads with like some of them like change the angle as you like ascend. Actually, I think the elevator in the
Interesting.
St. Louis Gateway Arch does that, where it just kind of like rotates as it goes up.
Yeah.
Since it's not a straight shot,
Fast.
since it's a parabola.
Yeah. Fascinating.
So the other thing about cable cars is that there is a building along the route, usually somewhere around the midway point of the cable, and that contains a steam engined power plant, or at least historically it was steam engine powered. The cable cars that are run in San Francisco have been modernized so that they run on electricity, and there are some other electronic systems that have been added to them. But that steam engine turns these giant wheels that the cables are wound around. And then beyond the powerhouse, the cable circulates through a trench that's built just underground. It's called a conduit. And building conduits is a whole ordeal. They have to be really strong enough that any vehicles passing over it does not crush the conduit. And they need
Wild.
to, usually the cable car builder, the company that's going to run the cable cars, has to move all of the public utilities, the sewers and the pipes, when they built the cable
Of course.
conduit.
Of course.
There's also a narrow slot running along the top of the conduit, which is how the cable cars access the cable. So each cable car has some sort of device that sticks out the bottom, inserts through the narrow slot, and then it has like a grabby hand at the end. And that whole assembly is called the grip.
Yeah.
And that's how cable cars work, at least in theory. In practice, there were so many real-world complications to building and maintaining a cable car line, I'm surprised they saw widespread use at all. If you were my poor long-suffering wife, you have heard repeatedly over the past week while I've been doing research how I don't actually believe cable cars exist at all. I'm pretty sure they're impossible. The issues included...
It is a wild
It's
system.
insane.
Yeah. The cables just keep running forever, and then the car just grabs onto the cable and then goes a while, stops.
Yeah, they're always running down there.
Yeah.
But when you think about
it's
it...
wild. I'm reaching above me because it feels a little less natural. But anyway.
Whoop. But when you think about it, like
Yeah.
it's kind of a natural... the electric lines are kind of a natural extension. Or if I put that a different way, the cable car is kind of an analog equivalent of electric lines. Just more insane because of all the moving parts. Yeah, so the issues that face any cable car railroad include water, ice, and debris that get into the conduits. So you need to have draining systems, and then you have to like get the gunk out periodically. The cables can stretch, fray, or break, so they need to be patched or replaced periodically. There's a very steep learning curve for operators of the vehicles because there are so many ways you could accidentally break millions of dollars of equipment running these things. Maybe not millions of dollars in 1870s money, but the equivalent. And then all the engineering hurdles that are needed to make a cable car line capable of crossing another cable car line or even just getting around a street corner.
But allegedly, it helps save us from killing horses, and also perhaps probably more relevantly, feeding and housing a bunch of horses.
That is a huge element that I left entirely out of my script, but yeah, let's talk about it. There were lots of animal rights advocates who argued against using beasts of burden in these roles. They were like really used up in these roles. They were very, very difficult, hard labor for the animals. And their lives were relatively short and miserable. They'd work 4-hour shifts. And then there was the extra complicating factor of a gigantic, what's called an epizootic, which is like an epidemic, but demos is people. So an epizootic is a disease outbreak among animals that killed a huge number of beasts of burden in American cities that were all absolutely necessary public infrastructure to keep things going. That was in 1872, which is the year in between the two Chicago fires in 71 and 73. So what a terrible stretch of time.
Yeah. I mean, far be it for me to suggest that the cable car companies were primarily concerned about animal welfare, weren't primarily concerned about animal welfare. But the other thing I was reading was talking about how because the animals had to work in shifts, there was a lot of downtime. Like you had to switch from one team to the other. Sometimes the animals would get tired early, so it was kind of unreliable. You know, allegedly the person who started the San Francisco ones saw like animals getting killed from a streetcar falling back on them. So, you know, that's probably a bummer for whoever is riding the cars too. So maybe a bad PR situation.
A bad PR situation. I gotta check how wet this is. Well, it'll last as long as it lasts. We'll just have to keep going.
Okay. So far so good.
We're running. It's a consumable It's a consumable resource. This ice. They only have so much of it. Despite my misgivings, it is an undeniable fact that cable cars were one of the most widespread urban transit technologies in the late 19th century. In San Francisco and Chicago, they outright dominated the transit landscape, at least for a while. In the 1870s, almost all mass transit was horse-drawn, either using streetcars that run along railroad tracks or trackless carriages, which were called omnibuses. Side note, that's where we get the word bus. It's an omnibus because everyone's allowed. It's for all, as opposed to a private carriage.
Right.
In contrast, the 1880s and 90s saw widespread experimentation with every available type of propulsion technology. Here's some weird stuff.
Can't wait.
Yeah. One of the problems was that vehicle-sized power plants were in their infancy. Miniature steam engines, called dummies, had poor acceleration, so they weren't suited for street traffic or frequent stops. Plus, they spewed steam and soot all over the streets. And despite efforts to disguise them as coaches, they freaked the fuck out of horses. That's on the upper left here. There's a steam dummy. It looks like a rail car, like a streetcar.
Yeah.
But it still made noise and steam and soot.
Yeah.
There were fireless locomotives, which were a variation on the steam engine. They were driven by reservoirs that had to periodically be refilled with either steam or compressed air along the route.
Oh, because fireless, they didn't produce their own steam.
Yeah,
so
they've still got like the cylindrical
right.
steam. That's not a boiler, but it's cylindrical because that's just a stable structure to hold superheated gas.
Yeah, that seems horribly inefficient and probably dangerous.
Yeah, they did see some use, I think, mostly in like mines and stuff, maybe?
Famously dangerous.
Yeah, I'm reaching a little bit. I think they're less dangerous than small steam locomotives. I'm not sure. Fireless locomotives at least addressed the soot problem.
A more pleasant riding experience, probably.
Potentially. Then there were the internal combustion engines, which would burn gasoline or lamp gas or some sort of distillate fuel.
Yeah, we like those in America.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Yeah. It's really energy dense. So it's great for compact power plants. This was too early for diesel, and also it was too early for prime time for all the other internal combustion engine variants as well. We're looking at a Connolly gas lamp, Connolly gas motor at the bottom left. Apparently, the two-stroke engines had a habit of exploding.
Oh, of course.
And anyway, everyone complained about the smell. I've also read about ammonia burning engines. I don't have any idea how that's supposed to work, and that can't have smelled good.
Wow. They really tried everything.
They tried literally everything. Finally, electric batteries were available, but they were unreliable and had terrible range. The obvious alternative to installing compact power plants onto every rail car was to build a large stationary power plant and then somehow transmit that energy along a linear corridor.
Yeah, honestly makes it sound almost logical when you
Yeah.
frame it in that way.
The benefit is that
Like
we
I
already
see
know.
the thought process.
The benefit is that steam engines, we know how they work, and we're pretty good at them by the late Victorian period. The drawback is that actually transmitting the energy involved extensive infrastructure construction and precision engineering. The main other example besides cable cars were atmospheric railroads, which used pneumatic tubes that pulled rail cars along, it sucked them along, using low pressure air. So imagine that you're drinking boba, and you're drinking it out of a straw. The tapioca is the train, and your mouth is the steam-powered vacuum pump.
Were these did these make it?
No.
Do we have those? Oh, okay.
There was some
I was
built.
trying to think through the logistics.
Yeah, I mean, what you'll see on top of the tube there underneath the locomotive or underneath the rail car is that there's like this line running along the top, and that is a like long valve that needs to be open only where the rail car is on top of, and then it needs to be closed everywhere else.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, fascinating. So it's the unholy bastard child of the cable car and the Hyperloop, and just like the Hyperloop, building and maintaining a very long corridor with no links is simply not viable. So you can see why cable cars seemed practical by comparison.
Good old Hyperloop.
Good old Hyperloop.
Yeah, another good West Coast reference there.
So other than those technologies, all of which we've gone over, there remains the electric trolley. Electric wires are so much easier to install and maintain than cable conduits, and they work in basically any street context. Electric streetcars are also called trolleys because there's a little wheel at the top of the trolley pole that's called a troller originally. The troller's got a little notch that aligns with the overhead wire. The first trolley success story in the U.S. was Montgomery, Alabama. We're looking at that here. It got the nickname the Lightning Route.
Oh, is it because of electricity or because it's really
of electricity
fast,
and because it's fast.
Okay.
As fast as 12 miles per hour. I don't know, so probably something like that. This was rolled out in 1886. There was also a trolley system in Scranton, Pennsylvania, introduced in 1887, which played on Scranton's nickname as the Electric City, because apparently they were an early adopter of electric utilities. But it's the trolley system in Richmond, Virginia, that's usually considered to be the model for electric streetcars across the country. The fact that the trolleys gained their foothold in small cities demonstrates how much cheaper and easier they were to build than cable cars, and potentially how invested a lot of the big cities already were in the cable car technology.
Yeah.
But by the end of the century, electric streetcars had taken over pretty much every U.S. city. There were still some stragglers, like Chicago, where the local elite resisted the installation of overhead wires downtown because they considered them to be ugly. You can kind of see in this photo of Montgomery how all the power lines they had back then were kind of an eyesore.
Yeah.
But even in Chicago, the cable cars were gradually replaced until the last one was run in 1906.
A brief and glorious run.
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's get in on that.
Yeah, what was the ridership like? You may be getting into this now.
Oh, that's a great question. I don't really have the stats. I mean, the ridership is kind of crazy. Sometimes. There was this photo that I forgot to add now that you mention it, where it's a cable car train being pulled to the Jackson Park at the 1893 World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition. And it is jam-packed on the interior and on the roof. Maybe I have to find this and insert it in the editing.
Wow.
Yeah. So brief and glorious history. Let's start looking at that history. I'm going to spare you the blow-by-blow of cable car development.
Oh, I know this place.
Yes. Back in San Francisco. The short version is that the first practical cable car line opened in San Francisco in 1873, followed by a proliferation of additional lines. The fact that cable cars get incredible traction, since they directly grip onto the moving cable, made them ideal for the hilly cities like, for example, San Francisco, Kansas City, and Seattle. Everyone appreciated how easily they climbed steep hills. The funny thing is that, for a while, streetcar companies around the country regarded San Francisco as like a unique edge case. Sure, cable cars might be a worthwhile infrastructure investment in hilly San Francisco, but surely they weren't a universal transit solution. So there's this funny symmetry where San Francisco cable cars are like this quirky oddity, both during the 1870s and in the present day.
Excellent. Well, famously, Chicago, not very hilly. So eventually people do decide that it is useful in non-hilly terrain.
Yeah. Uh-oh. There we go.
Ooh.
We're still
Getting lost
operating
in the
at
West.
the computational edge of this computer's abilities, but no. Cable cars were only taken seriously as an all-purpose transit technology once they were introduced to Chicago.
Interesting.
The person most responsible for this shift is probably Charles Holmes, the president of the Chicago City Railway. These are the cable car lines that were built by the Chicago City Railway.
Mm-hmm.
After visiting San Francisco, the CCR leadership were so impressed, they pivoted immediately into converting some of the major horse car lines into cable car lines. More than that, Holmes was a cable car evangelist. Along with a group of investors, he bought out streetcar companies in St. Louis and Los Angeles, and subsequently built Chicago-style cable car lines in both those cities. So some local Chicago context here. Although streetcar companies nominally competed with each other, this was more true in some cities than others.
Mm-hmm.
For example, we just saw San Francisco's cable car lines, which are tightly packed together on parallel corridors that offer dense service near downtown with multiple choices for companies to patronize. In Chicago, the exact opposite was true.
Yeah, I was wondering if you were skipping over some lines or because this is not a lot of lines.
Way
or coverage.
sparser, yeah. So that was a map of all of San Francisco's cable car lines. This is, we're going one company at a time here, so this is just the south side.
Got it.
Yeah. But yes, in Chicago, the exact opposite was true. By the 1880s, there were effectively just 3 transit companies, each operating a monopoly on their sector of the city. The Chicago River conveniently divides Chicago into the north, west, and south sides, which were also formal political divisions. Charles Holmes' CCR had a monopoly on the south side, which at this time was the wealthiest part of the city. Of the 3 street railroads, CCR also had the best reputation with the public, and they were known for innovation and reliability. After all, they were the company that introduced the cable car. The first Chicago City Railway cable car line was along State Street, so it's the one on the west here. It opened in 1882 and was an instant sensation. Journalists reported that wealthy riders who would usually use carriages flocked to the cable car alongside the rest of society.
Fascinating.
Actually, maybe I understated that a little bit. The cable cars were considered upscale. Like, the fare was maybe a little too expensive for poor people, and they still had to walk, in many cases, at least if they were commuting.
That's the secret. We need to make some public transit options seem upscale again.
Yeah, it needs to be exclusive.
Well, some of them. We obviously just want everybody on them. So
We
make
just
it
need,
a
like,
hot commodity.
divided. We need divided tiers of transit, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm fine with rich people driving their cars in the city. I just want to charge them $50 a pop to do it.
Right. I mean, the problem
I
is
think
that
the
they're
congestion
not
charging is
paying
right
into the
on.
system.
That combined with
paying.
converting a lot of city streets into car exclusive zones would be good too.
That's a separate topic.
That's a separate topic.
Cable car is not the solution, as it turns out, to all of our mass transit.
Cable car, rapid transit. Yeah. People first encountering cable cars had a hard time believing their eyes. This is cheating a little because this account is from a visit to San Francisco, not Chicago, but Rudyard Kipling wrote, "There's no visible agency of their flight, but once in a while you pass a 5-storied building humming with machinery that winds up an everlasting wire cable, and the initiated will tell you that here is the mechanism. If it pleases Providence to make a car run up and down a little slit in the ground for many miles, and if for 2 pence and halfpenny I can ride in that car, why should I seek the reasons of the miracle?" So I'm not exactly a Kipling stan, but
Yeah. And they are pretty remarkable to look at, I will say. Like, obviously a big, tourist trap for people in the city, but it is cool to see just like the car moving along the ground. You don't see any visible means of propulsion.
yeah,
Because they don't have any on the cars.
no. Mind-boggling. And to be fair, the more I looked into the mechanisms by which, the details of the mechanisms by which cable cars run, I'm like, okay, this is ridiculous. So complex. So the second line would be to the east, the Cottage Grove Avenue line. So you can see that they run parallel on State and Wabash until 22nd, now Cermak. And then it reroutes to Cottage Grove, and they're a little more separate. The original line took the cable car along 55th Street to a little turnaround loop along the Illinois Central Railroad tracks. And right next to Jackson Park, which was the site of the 1893 World's Fair. There is a waiting room, so-called waiting room, although apparently it was more of a break room for the vehicle operators, that still exists just south of 55th Street along this railroad viaduct, or this railroad embankment. So it's this little tiny pointed roof there, or a little tiny sloped roof there next to the tracks.
Yeah, I guess I've been past that at some point. I don't
Yeah, it's
remember seeing it.
currently the Hyde Park Historical Society building. Needless to say, the Cottage Grove line saw huge amounts of traffic during the Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair. We talked about that a little bit. And then later an extension was built down to the Oakwood Cemetery. There's the fact that the Cottage Grove line had to negotiate 2 relatively sharp turns along Cermak Street. Cermak Road? Whatever, 22nd Street at the time. Which made it more challenging to operate and maintain than the dead straight State Street line. That's because the bends put strain on the cable and decreases its service life. That's actually true for all streetcar cables. The more bends there are, the faster the cable starts to fray or maybe even snap.
That makes sense, yeah.
Luckily, cable cars tend to fail safe. That is to say, if the cable breaks or stops circulating, then all the cable cars attached to it simply coast or grind to a halt. However, it was possible for the grip to get caught in a frayed cable, in which case the car would just plow into anything in front of it, which would cause ridiculous, riotous scenes of confusion as an entire column of streetcars and then all of the other traffic on the street struggles to keep in front of the runaway car.
Yeah, I feel like the other issue, that's the safety, but I feel like the other issue is that I think later on they had other ones, but they used manual grip, right? So the operator, if they do make a mistake with the grip, they're not going super fast. I think it's like 10 miles per hour or something, but with a big vehicle going 10 miles per hour, that could still be.
Yeah. The nice thing about cable cars, they're very light. They're wood. They're basically all wood.
Oh.
So from that perspective, they had a limited amount of momentum they could cause damage with.
Right.
Speaking of coming off the cable and coming back onto it, these little wheel icons on these maps, which are from the book Chicago Cable Cars by Greg Borzo, which is excellent. The basis for much of my research. The little wheels indicate where the cable car would have had to release the cable coasted through, and then reattached.
Mm.
So a lot of these are at the beginnings and ends of cables. So for example, if we look on the State Street line, the cable starts around 22nd Street, extends south to 39th Street. That was a single cable, and it was running that circuit
Yeah.
along State Street between those 2 points.
All right.
The two CCR lines established some important precedents for how Chicago cable cars would operate. Unlike San Francisco, cable cars in Chicago operated in trains consisting of multiple rail cars, usually up to 3 cars long. In these trains, the front rail car was a grip car, and the cars behind it were called trailers. Actually, I have an image for this. So here's a typical train.
Gotcha.
So that front open car we're looking at is the grip car, and the 2 behind it are trailers. The difference between grips and trailers is that only the grip cars attached to the cable. The trailers, by contrast, were free rolling. They're just along for the ride. Usually, like in this picture, the grip cars in Chicago were a bit shorter than the trailers that they pulled. There were also both summertime and wintertime trailers. So what we're looking at here are wintertime trailers. The summertime ones didn't have enclosed walls. Remember, there's no air conditioning.
That's right. But still high scale, so you have, different settings at least.
Yeah. High what?
Sorry, this is a high class transit system.
Oh, yes. Yeah, there's some attention to comfort.
Yeah, summer carriages and your winter carriages.
Yes. Which also meant they had to maintain larger fleets than they otherwise would have. One of the smartest moves from CCR's route designers was to use standard gauge for the tracks on the new cable car lines. That's 4 feet, 8.5 inches.
Wow.
So
look at that.
Gauge is the distance between the 2 tracks on a railroad, and almost all American railroads use standard gauge. Now, there's exceptions. Most of them are tourist trains or Bay Area Rapid Transit, which uses a bizarre broad gauge. What is going on?
Could have a whole bonus episode about weirdness in the Bay Area transit systems.
Oh yeah. We're going to talk about the key system. We're going to talk about Southern Pacific.
Yeah, was there a particular specific motivation for using a train as opposed to single cars?
Capacity. They're high capacity lines.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah. This would be like on modern Chicago Transit Authority, you have 40-foot buses, you have 60-foot buses. While the high-capacity routes, you're going to use a bunch of 60-foot buses.
And I wonder, because the lines are less dense, right? So you want higher capacity on fewer lines.
That's
San Francisco is so, crisscross and overlapping that I imagine, one car could just go. You would switch between lines.
That's fair, yeah. I think the system was more radial back then. Nowadays, there's all these grid-shaped Chicago bus lines, which developed with the electric streetcars originally. Yeah, if we go back to that image, the author of the book, Greg Borzo, has these sort of thinner lines, and those are street horse cars, just the ones that connect to the to the cable car lines.
Right.
There were more than this, but these are the ones that connected to the cable car lines. Now, what's really neat is because they used standard gauge, which the horse-drawn streetcars were already using, it meant that you could attach a horse car onto the back of a cable car train.
Whoa.
Which allowed you to have like a single seat transfer.
Huh.
So as the cable cars worked their way toward downtown, they tended to pick up additional streetcars.
Interesting.
And then once electric trolleys were introduced in some of the outer neighborhoods, because the cable cars were in the inner neighborhoods, the practice was continued, which results in weird situations like decrepit old grip cars pulling shiny new trolleys through downtown.
That's so funny. I like the image of just a cable car kind of just like growing as it goes along its route. You just have these little trailers and trolleys getting added along.
Isn't it awesome? I'm sure there were like some operational delays, but this thing is moving, the fastest cable car lines moved at 14 miles an hour max.
Yeah.
So it may have been less of a concern.
Very funny.
All right. Well, now it's time for another character, and this guy is like the biggest character, so he gets a portrait. Normally, since Chicago land is the geographic history, I'm less concerned with biographies, but this guy, oh my god. This is Charles Yerkes. Ever heard the name Yerkes?
That does sound familiar.
Yerkes. No, he's not a villain from the Animorph series.
I understood that reference. I can't place anything else. It sounds familiar.
Yeah, so Yerkes will be a name that's familiar to you only if you have an interest in Chicago history or if you happen to know about the Yerkes Observatory on Lake Geneva in southern Wisconsin. The Yerkes Observatory was built by the University of Chicago with funding from Charles Yerkes. It was essentially his biggest act of philanthropy in his life. He was not a philanthropist. He kind of got guilted into it. By William Rainey Harper, the first president of the University of Chicago.
I feel like I can tell by the size and shape of his mustache that he's like a money guy that wasn't very into philanthropy.
Yeah. I keep trying to imagine his face like on the street today, and I'm like, no, that's a face that only exists in the Victorian period. I don't know what it is. I mean, obviously the mustache, but even if you took it off, I'm like, I don't know, man.
I don't think he exists without the mustache at this point.
Anyway, back in the 1880s and 1890s, Yerkes was a name that everyone knew, at least if they read any of the Chicago newspapers. Originally from Philadelphia, Yerkes was sort of an exile due to a speculation scheme gone wrong. He had been a financial broker for the city of Philadelphia, which gave him access to city funds. He leveraged the city money to take out massive debts, which he invested in the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was like the world's largest company. But then the Great Chicago Fire in 1871 caused a little miniature panic, a recession in the country's economy. And Yerkes did not have the money to pay up. He was sent to jail, but first he blackmailed the Republican candidate for governor of Pennsylvania, who had also been speculating with public money.
Of course.
Ulysses Grant's presidential campaign freaked out when they realized that the blackmail might cost the Republicans the state of Pennsylvania, which would probably kill Grant's chance at re-election. So the outgoing Republican governor quietly pardoned Yerkes on the condition that he denied the evidence of corruption, which was absolutely real, by the way. So everyone involved was corrupt, and they all got away with it.
Incredible.
The Republican Party, ladies and gentlemen.
Excellent.
This is what you can do if you win the Civil War. You can just be in charge of everything if you want to be for like almost every president of the United States from like the Civil War up until like Woodrow Wilson was like a Republican from Ohio. It's insane how many of them are just Republicans from Ohio.
I mean, what are people going to do? Start another Civil War,
Yeah, fat chance. We won, buddy.
Wow.
Okay. So afterwards, Yerkes was persona non grata in Philly, so he headed out to the frontier. After some wheeling dealing in Fargo, North Dakota, and a divorce with his first wife, he moved to Chicago with a new younger wife.
Of course.
At first, he was accepted in the elite Union League Club, but just as quickly he was ejected when his jail time and divorce were discovered. Yerkes embraced his heel turn and soon made powerful enemies all over the city. Most importantly, he alienated the press. So here we go. He made an enemy of former Mayor Joseph Medill, who owned the Republican-leaning Chicago Tribune. Then he made enemies with former Mayor Carter Harrison III, who was the owner of the Democrat-leaning Chicago Times. And for good measure, he made enemies with the owner of the mass-market Chicago Daily News, which was avowedly non-political.
Wow. Honestly impressive.
Apparently, the only paper that ever said anything nice about him was the Chicago Inter-Ocean, which may have contributed to Yerkes' decision to buy the Inter-Ocean to forward his own agenda in 1895.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Okay, we can finally move on.
Yeah, I mean, if you can't get the newspapers to write nice things about you, buy it or make your own.
That's right, make your own newspaper.
Yeah.
To be fair to his detractors, Yerkes was an absolute bastard. First of all, the man absolutely had mistresses. There are implications he was sleeping with other men's wives, which certainly couldn't have helped his popularity. More importantly, I think, were his systematically shady and deceitful business practices.
Right. I feel like I was clued in by the corruption scandal at the beginning, but
This is off
nice
to a
to see
bad
that he's
start.
consistent.
Although Chicagoans correctly identified him as the city's most powerful transit tycoon, technically he was the outright owner of no railroads. Instead, he assembled syndicates of investors through which he would unofficially gain a controlling interest in each company. For example, the first company he gained control of was the North Chicago City Railway in 1886. Since no one in Chicago wanted to loan him money, Yerkes hit up his old Philadelphia pals. Together, they contributed $1.5 million, which jointly gave them a controlling interest in the North Side Streetcar Company. Simultaneously, they formed the North Chicago Street Railroad. Keeping track, this is a different company.
Okay.
And they had it issue $1.5 million in bonds. So, effectively, the Philly Syndicate spent none of their own money since they just saddled this new company with their debts.
Wow. I think we're still doing that kind of stuff today. Great to see that we have a long and storied history.
Oh, it's a proud
of,
American
just
tradition.
saddling, debt, moving debt into a different company instead.
Yes. Then they made the old company lease all of its assets to the new company, which is what the name they operated under.
Sure, yeah.
North Chicago Street Railroad. Then, in 1887, Yerkes used similar hijinks to take control of the West Chicago Street Railroad, although by this point his syndicate included Chicago investors who were also his enemies. But everyone turned a huge profit, so...
Wow, yeah, of course.
And now he had a transit monopoly on both the North Side and the West Side.
Wow.
Let's talk routes. So this is the original North Chicago Street Railroad cable car lines. The first one was on Clark Street with a parallel line on 5th Avenue, which we know as Wells Street. Apparently, this is irrelevant, but apparently Wells Street had become a total hub for gangsters and prostitution.
Oh, fun.
So in order to not sully the name of Wells, they renamed it 5th Avenue, being the only numbered avenue in the city of Chicago. Fake 5th
That's
Avenue.
very funny. Very funny.
It was renamed Wells later.
Right.
Renamed back to Wells. So it's got this kind of funny parallel scheme with two streets along the north side. A branch on Lincoln Avenue was opened in 1889, and the final branch on Clybourne was opened in 1891. In 1895, Yerkes had the original Ferris wheel from the 1893 World's Fair moved to the northern terminal of the Clark Street line. So that would be somewhere around here. I think in the neighborhood of Lincoln Park. The idea is to drum up extra trips on the line, with passengers paying to come out to the edge of town to ride the attraction. This actually would become a pretty common scheme for transit companies around the turn of the century. We'd call this a trolley park. Although, of course, this is a cable car, not a trolley.
Right. I have heard of this.
In this case, there wasn't much demand, and the Ferris wheel got shipped off to St. Louis for their 1904 World's Fair. It is kind of surreal to just see this, like, outer neighborhood with its dirt roads and this gigantic friggin' thing just dominating the skyline. That would have been cool to see. It would have been by far the tallest thing around.
That's huge.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if this image is to scale, but
I think it's
huge.
just a photograph.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a little, I can't quite tell from the vision on here, but wow. Photographs usually to scale.
Sometimes. Then the west side was the last to start building cable car lines.
Uh-huh.
Under Yerkes' control, the WCSRs, West Chicago Street Railroads, first lines were along Milwaukee Avenue and Madison Street. They opened in 1890.
Mm-hmm.
The last two lines went to the southwest along Blue Island Avenue and Halsted Street, so we can see all of those.
Yeah.
Those two lines weren't completed until 1894, after a few of the first electric trolley lines had been built on the far west and far south sides, and after two of the elevated rapid transit lines had been built. So we already have Chicago L at this point.
Cool.
At least the first couple lines. On the south side to Jackson Park, and then on Lake Street on the west side.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now we get to talk about the original loop.
Oh, was noticing a distinct hub and spoke situation going on. So
now that we've looked at the three main companies, or the three cable car operating companies in Chicago, we can see, I've put them all together here in the context of the modern city. You notice how far south those Chicago City Railway lines go.
Yeah.
But also the hub and spoke model, where basically all of the lines terminate in downtown streetcar loops.
Yep.
And then proceed directly out from there. Radially.
Right, not quite as loopy as the modern L, or not one loop, rather.
Yeah, it's 5 loops.
Yeah. Pluses and minuses, I guess.
Yes. So since all of the lines converged on a central location in downtown, that's what we would today call the loop, capital L, which is named after the downtown elevated rapid transit loop, where most of the transit lines converge. But that wasn't built until the 1890s. Before that, there were multiple loops. Each one of the main cable car lines had its own loop downtown, which allowed the streetcars to turn around and make their outbound trips.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, Chicagoans at the time did call them loops, even before the rapid transit lines.
Nice.
But the name loop for the neighborhood doesn't seem to have caught on until later.
The loops, or the loops area, doesn't quite have the same kind of...
The Loops District. Brother, may I have some Loops District? There are a few reasons why the different cable car lines each got their own separate loops. The biggest was that cable car lines interact poorly with each other. If you want two cable car lines to converge onto a single track, that means that either cars from one line need to release their grip and reattach after the junction, or you need to run two parallel cables underneath the same track. So the CCR, the Chicago City Railway, here in red and orange, originally used the two-cable strategy. So this orange loop to the right was built later. Originally, both lines ran on this sort of darker red loop.
Mm-hmm.
So they actually had two parallel cables running along underneath that loop. Eventually, the complication of operating those double cables proved too challenging, so a separate loop that we see here to the east over to Michigan Avenue was built. And then there's the fact that making cable car lines cross over each other is an absolute nightmare. In these cases, it was common practice for the company building the new cable car line to bear the cost of installing the intersection. The newcomer would also be forced to place their cable underneath the existing line, which would force their cable cars to detach the grips, coast through the intersection, and then reattach on the other side.
Of course.
This was a major issue in San Francisco, for example.
Yeah, dense, very dense, lots of overlap.
Yeah.
So
in Chicago, I think almost all of the cable car line intersections were right here, where the NCSR and WCSR had an overlap in their loops. The North Chicago lines in green were there first, so the West Chicago lines in blue had to re-engineer the intersections. But the WCSR thought that direct access to the department stores on State Street made it worth the cost and hassle.
Of course.
Marshall Fields and Company.
Yeah.
Marshall Fields was one of the guys who helped invest in the syndicate to buy the West Chicago City Railway for Yerkes, by the way. One of his enemies. In other locations, streetcar companies went out of their way to avoid crossovers, so that's why we see like in some places, cable cars running on the wrong side of the road.
Oh, that's funny.
Then there's another logistical question. Lawrence, maybe you've noticed something about the river.
Yes. How do you run a cable car across a river?
I'm glad you asked that.
Yeah.
All the bridges over the Chicago River are drawbridges. So they're designed to
Uh-huh.
lift up when a freighter comes through. You physically can't run a cable across any of the Chicago River bridges because they would have to be severed somehow. Nowadays, the bridges get raised pretty infrequently. Notably, Mayor Lori Lightfoot ordered the bridges to be raised during Black Lives Matter protests so that the cops could tea kettle peaceful protesters.
Our favorite mayor for sure.
Yeah, and she was supposed to be a defense attorney. Every mayor gets beaten down by the cops, no matter who you are.
Yeah.
Editing Xavier here. Turns out Mayor Lightfoot was a federal prosecutor, not a defense attorney. So go figure. Anyway.
Hey, recording this on the eve of Cuomo's defeat in the Democratic primary in New York
Did he
City.
get beaten?
So that's fun. He called in to concede.
Whoa!
Yeah. So I don't know what's gonna happen with Adams yet, but Cuomo did concede.
Wait, Adams isn't running in the Democratic primary, is he?
No, not in the primary. I mean, I don't know what's gonna
Oh,
happen
yeah,
in
yeah,
November
yeah, yeah.
when there's in the general.
God,
Yeah.
New York mayorships are insane. There's so many insane mayors. Whatever.
That's a different bonus episode.
Aside here, I live right next to the Tappan Zee Bridge, which is officially the Governor Mario M. Cuomo Tappan Zee Bridge. But every instance of Governor Mario M. Cuomo that is at street level has on a sign has either been like gouged out or spray painted over. That's how much Andrew has marred his father's legacy.
Ugh.
Anyway.
Yep.
So yeah, cable, the bridges, the cables. So, luckily, there were already a couple of tunnels that ran underneath the river. There was one to the north side on LaSalle Street and one to the west side on Washington Street. So that's the one here to the north and the one here to the northwest.
That's right. You did promise underground tunnel content.
Tunnel content. There is so much underground. It's incredible how much there is underground in Chicago, considering that there is no like solid ground there.
Yeah.
It's baffling.
Yeah. We made the ground.
It just floats. The damn city just floats.
Yeah.
Whatever. In the past, the tunnels had been popular for both horse-drawn carriages and pedestrian traffic, but by the time the cable cars showed up, both tunnels were dingy and leaky. When the NCSR and WCSR took over the tunnels, they had to reinforce and refurbish them. The WCSR also built a second, totally new tunnel north of Van Buren Street to give their Blue Island Avenue and Halsted Street lines access to downtown. So that's the one down here. It's not actually on Van Buren Street, it's just kind of just north of it. Curiously, the three tunnels had overhead electric wires installed on their ceilings.
Okay.
The reason being that the cable cars had short little wires on top of them that they could use to power their onboard headlights while they were in the tunnels.
Cute.
As necessary as the tunnels were, they were a total headache for cable car operation. This is the one on LaSalle Street. The entry ramps into the tunnels were basically the only non-flat portion of the entire Chicago cable car network.
Right. Yeah.
The Van Buren Street tunnel was even steeper than the others, with a maximum 12% grade, which is pretty crazy for a rail vehicle. On the other hand, they're grippy. They're cable cars. It should be fine.
Yeah.
I guess sometimes they struggled for enough power. I'm wondering if the steam power plants were just less powerful than in hilly cities like San Francisco because they didn't have to deal with it much.
Well, also you're like basically compensating. You have to compensate for on the whole route for those little, basically for the tunnels.
Yeah, although the cable's running all the time. but it does make the car effectively the rail cars effectively. I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly what the issue is. Maybe it's an issue with the grip design.
Uh,
Anyway, if the grips ever slipped from the cable during descent or ascent, the cable car trains might roll uncontrolled down into the tunnel with possibly disastrous results. More commonly, a disabled train needed to be pushed out with help from the train behind it. Little help from my friends. Once electric trolleys were introduced, weirdly, the WCSR started using a push-pull configuration with the grip car leading and the
huh.
trolley pushing.
Oh my gosh. Just combined. Did it go faster, or is that just like saving energy or
No, it can't go
something?
faster than the cable, right? There's no way to go faster than the cable.
Oh, right, because the cable was at a fixed
So I guess
speed.
it's
So
just helping
maybe it
it.
like right, maybe it saves energy for the general engine because of the electricity.
Yeah, maybe, or it might. I think, again, it must be the grip, right? It must be the grips.
Yeah, fascinating. Now I'm imagining you have like these cable cars have like added on a few little trailers, and then so it's a longer train, and then
Yeah.
another longer train connects to the previous. Now you
Yeah,
just have
use
two long.
distributed power, just like have like a gigantic long train with grips and trolleys just interspersed throughout.
Yeah, you just merge the snakes together, you know?
They just make one giant cable car. That's the next step, right? Because you never have to worry about cable cars running into each other if the entire cable car line is just all carriages,
Oh, perfect.
all
All lines.
streetcars.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
This
You
is
can
never
get
not a
on at any
streetcar.
point. Yeah,
Yeah,
perfect.
it's just a wall.
It's not going that fast. You could just like hop on, you
Yeah,
know?
you'd have to climb over to get across the street. The
Beautiful.
legal framework for operating streetcars in Chicago was persistently contentious and bewilderingly confusing.
Uh-huh.
Both Chicago City Council and the Illinois State Congress had substantial influence in regulating the privately owned street railroads, and they didn't always agree. The outstanding issue was that companies required franchises, that's a legal permission, that specified where and for how long each company was allowed to run streetcars on public streets, as well as which types of streetcar technologies would be used, like horse cars or cable cars or trolleys.
Sure, sure.
The main way to get a franchise was to. What do you think the main way to get a franchise is in Victorian
Uh,
Chicago?
bribery.
Yes! The main way was to bribe the hell out of city aldermen, which were called boodle, by the way. It was called boodle at the time.
Nice, nice.
Meanwhile, reformers were intent on removing corrupt aldermen from office. The situation made streetcar companies public targets since they were highly visible utility monopolies that were used by a wide swathe of the public.
All right.
Streetcar companies obviously wanted long term franchises that would give them permanent monopolies, which seemed anti democratic to the reformers. Really,
Yeah.
the street railways were damned if they boodled and damned if they didn't boodle. Thank you, that's the best sentence I've ever written.
It's pretty good. Pretty good quality content.
By the turn of the century, reform sentiment had swelled to the point where streetcar regulation was in total deadlock. No franchises could be issued or updated. The issue had previously arisen in 1883, but at that point, all parties reached a compromise to just extend the existing franchises to 1903.
Of course.
Well, then 1903 happened. The deadline approached and passed, and put the legal status of public transit into total limbo. None of the big three streetcar companies was willing to invest in modernization as long as the cloud hovered over them.
Excellent.
Although the reformers were noble enough in their goals, the public at large bore the brunt of the consequences, while streetcars in Chicago became increasingly dilapidated. So here is a fun mixed consist. There's a grip car at the front, a cable car trailer behind it, and at the back is an electric trolley with its trolley pole tied down.
Right. The nice little get some push pull action going.
Well, not at this point because there's no
Oh, yes,
electric wires in downtown.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So I'm noticing that you said the continuation was until 1903.
1903.
Yeah, that's also based because they don't last very long after that. So
No.
yeah,
And
it
there's
was
an increasing number.
1906.
There's an increasing number. Yeah. 1906. There's an increasing number of electric streetcars throughout the city, but mostly in the further parts, like the further neighborhoods, because the
Yeah.
cable cars haven't been converted yet, or at least not all of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yerkes, exasperated, consolidated his two streetcar companies together and then sold out. He also, at the time, sold his controlling interest in two of the four elevated railroad companies. Yes, he controlled the Lake Street Elevated and the South Side Elevated, which is basically the entire Green Line today.
Excellent.
Once Yerkes was gone, it became clear that the new Chicago Union Traction Company was in crippling debt.
You saying he saddled this company with debt before he sold it?
Yes, yes, he did.
He did it again?
Yep.
Wow. How could anyone have seen this coming?
Then, yeah, who could have foreseen the consequences?
Yeah, this is a system that works well.
It works well for certain people. Of course, he's like a sort of angry, frustrated old man at this point.
Right.
Once he moved to New York, by the way, he had a mansion on Fifth Avenue, the real Fifth Avenue, not the fake Chicago Fifth Avenue. Once he was in New York, he got tapped to finance the London Underground. That's an entirely different story. And anyway, he died shortly in 1905, before the last cable cars were even finished.
Wow.
So, what a life.
Good old Yerkes.
Coincidentally, 1905 was also the year that Chicago finally sorted out the franchise debates. This is often written about as the franchise war or the traction war. Traction because, I don't know, streetcars are sometimes called traction, like electric traction.
Right. They have good traction.
I don't really understand it. Cable cars have incredible traction, but electric rail cars, not so much. I don't know.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of companies that ran electric streetcars or interurbans, and they called themselves traction companies. Anyway, after waiting so long, the streetcar companies got virtually everything they wanted. Extended franchises, the ability to consolidate even further into a literal monopoly, just one company, and the construction of electric trolley wires in downtown. The electrification of the existing cable car lines was complete in 1906, marking the end of an era.
No more cable cars.
But that's not to say that the 24 years of cable cars in Chicago left no lasting impact. This is taking a long time. There we go.
There we go.
We can point to at least three existing structures: the waiting room in Hyde Park, as well as two former powerhouses on the near north side and near west side.
Huh.
More importantly, the cable cars revolutionized mobility for Chicagoans. So this is a map in 1888, about the time when some of the cable car lines have been built, and then kind of the midway point between the beginning of building cable car lines and the end of building cable car lines. And you can see that the cable cars kind of match the dimensions of the urbanized parts of the city.
And are similar to some of the current L lines. Not identical, but some similarities.
Some similarities. Yeah, I mean, this is a time shortly after, this is shortly before the Great Annexation, where the city of Chicago annexed the townships of Lakeview, Jefferson, Lake, and Hyde Park, which tripled the size of the city. Yeah, we've talked about it previously on the grid.
Oh, did you? Okay, I don't remember that part.
Residents of suburbs like Lincoln Park, Garfield Park, and Hyde Park, yes, every place in Chicago is a park, don't worry about it, could get to the offices and department stores of downtown Chicago in usually around an hour, in some lines more like 90 minutes, in relative comfort. With Chicago's population doubling from 500,000 in 1880 to 1 million, or just over 1 million, in 1890, so that's 100% growth.
Huge. Not as big as 1,000% growth, but pretty good.
Not as big as 1,000% growth. During that period, the cable cars briefly became the transit backbone of the fastest growing city in the United States. And that's the story of the cable cars.
Well, fun non-Chicago fact: there is, in fact, a currently non-touristy cable car still in use in the Bay Area.
Oh, the Oakland Airport Connector.
I figured you would probably know about this. Yeah, I would. This is something that came up during my 30 minutes of research.
Yes. Now, do automated people movers that have cable power sources count as cable cars? I mean, maybe, because it does technically grip the cable, then detach it in order to get onto the next cable.
Yeah, I think it depends. I mean, based on the logic, based on the definition we provided at the top of the episode, yes, because
It
we
is a
did
cable
not
car.
specify.
But not a street
powers.
car.
Not a streetcar for sure, and also not a manually powered cable car, which the San Francisco tourist cable cars is the only one still in operation. Because,
What's a manually
manually?
powered?
No, are they say not manually powered? Manually.
This man's
they
reading
say?
Wikipedia facts to me.
I
Give
had
it to
30
me. Give it to me.
minutes,
Give it to me.
so manually operated. Yeah, because they
Okay.
manually detach and attach.
Okay.
The gripper
Right.
still.
Right.
Um,
Whereas the Oakland
everything
People
else
Mover is a totally automated guideway.
functions all right. Is better than the old bus / shuttle system for the Oakland area, at least. So that's something. Yeah.
My feet
And
should never
apparently-
touch the ground. Exclusive luxury transit.
And what was funny for me to learn about and kind of made sense is that the cable car system in San Francisco is apparently a big revenue generator for the Muni system.
Yes, but then I also read that there's a ridiculous amount of conductors disappearing cash fares.
Were we on the
this
same
is a
Wikipedia
contentious? Oh yeah, this is a contentious
Yeah.
topic. I mean, I don't want to trust anything that Gavin says because that man's fucking slimy.
That's right. Yes, his quote about how he observed several conductors pocketing cash fares.
That man is awful.
Oh man.
Anyway,
Yeah, he's one
are
of the
there any
people
mayors
actually-
that we like? Lori Lightfoot, Scott Adams, Andrew Cuomo, not a mayor.
Likely, he
Gavin
did say
Newsom.
he might run as an independent.
Adams.
No, Adams is running as an independent. Cuomo said he might run as an independent in the general as well.
New York mayor elections are insane. All right.
Just do fucking whatever, apparently. I mean, especially if you have the amount of money that, Cuomo is able to generate. Like, he
Guess
could
so.
actually physically do it.
Well, we're off
Yes.
topic. Anyhow, thank you for coming on to
Yes,
this
it's super
cable
late on
car
your end.
episode.
Yes.
Where can the good people watching Chicagoland and listening to it find more Lawrence Wang, if you want to be reached at all?
I don't really have any content of my own to promote. So I guess if you or anyone you know is in need of emotional support or undergoing a mental health crisis of any kind, you can call the 988 Lifeline, where somebody will be able to help you or those you love. So available 24/7. Also, if you are politically inclined, the government did decide to discontinue the LGBTQ plus subnetwork of 988. So write to your legislators to see if they'll do anything about that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, if I can amplify that even a little bit, that's worthwhile.
Yeah, the calls will still be taken in by the network, and call centers will do their best to take the calls, but we don't specialize in working with LGBTQIA plus community members, and that was a big part of having that sub network, was allowing that kind of peer support and more specialized support.
Yeah. It's been a lovely episode. I'll see y'all next time. You've been listening to Chicagoland, a production by Articulata Publishing. Chicagoland is written, edited, and produced by Xavier. The Chicagoland theme was composed by Chris Robbin. That's ChrisRobbin.